Thank you for joining us for the second of 3 spring lectures of the 2026 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. Before we begin, we ask that you all please mute your devices. Should you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions to Esley Hamilton. And now, I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, President of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He'll introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our lecture series. It's my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker, Esley Hamilton, honorary AIA and past preservation historian, St. Louis County Parks. Historian, preservationist, critic, the answer man, irreplaceable, tenacious, a force to be reckoned with, a bridge between the profession and the public, a library on feet, and a St. Louis treasure are but a few of the ways people have described Esley Hamilton. Simply put, Esley Hamilton is the most knowledgeable and admired figure in historic preservation in St. Louis and well beyond. For 40 years, he served as preservation historian for the St. Louis County Parks and Recreation Department. He retired as preservation historian after cataloging more than 4,000 county buildings and adding 300 properties and 8 historic districts to the National Register of Historic Places. In 2014, Esley was granted one of the four professionals to be honored in Washington, D.C. at the Secretary of the Interior Historic Preservation Award Ceremony, winning in the Certified Local Government category. In 2013, Esley Hamilton was one of 5 nationally to be selected as an honorary member recipient of the American Institute of Architects. He's an honorary member of AIA St. Louis and a recipient of the President's Award of the Landmarks Association of St. Louis. In 2009, the University of Missouri St. Louis granted him an honorary degree of the Doctor of Arts and Letters. In 2005, Missouri Governor Matt Blunt gave him the Rosier Award, the state's highest preservation honor. Trustee of the National Association of Homestead Parks. He is also an editor and contributing author of the newsletter of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He generously shares his encyclopedic knowledge of architectural history here and abroad through countless speeches, writing, and good counsel. Tonight, Esley will talk about William Morris and the arts and crafts movement in America. Inspired by William Ruskin, William Morris began in the 1850s a lifelong campaign to reform British design by following the medieval model of handcrafting native materials and traditional building practices. His design firm influenced residential architecture and all the decorative arts, including furniture, ceramics, glass, and textiles. By the turn of the century, his influence had spread to America, led by such people as Gustav Stickley, Albert Hubbard, Frank Lloyd Wright, and locally E.G. Lewis of University City. By 1920, the movement had passed its peak, but beginning in the 1970s, appreciation revived. Today, arts and crafts architecture and design are more popular than ever. This talk takes a closer look at this remarkable story. And now, please welcome Esley Hamilton as he presents William Morris and the Arts and Crafts Movement in America. Esley?
Thank you very much. You just spared me having to repeat the first part of my talk, which was about the fact that although we think of the arts and crafts movement as one of the most important design trends of the 19th and 20th century now, and really think of it as being still pretty vital today, it actually was pretty much over by 1920. And it was revived, I would say, initially by this building on the, this book on the left. Can we do something with these lights here that are blocking people's view of the image?
Sorry, the lights are stuck on tonight. Sorry. We got an issue with the lights, so.
That's it?
I'm afraid so.
Well, it hardly seems worth continuing. But this was an exhibition that was held at Princeton in the 1920s, and the main curator was Robert Judson Clark. And he divided the movement into regions of the United States and looked at furniture, textiles, stained glass, metalwork, wallpaper, and this book was particularly influential in identifying art pottery movements, of which University Cities was one. And this led to a revival of interest in collecting of arts and crafts pottery, and really to a revival of some of the pottery companies that were just about moribund at that time. But there was no architecture mentioned. The Field Guide to American Houses did, in 1984, is generally thought of as the most influential and definitive analysis of houses in the United States, because the writers actually went around the United States and took pictures of what people were actually living in, whereas previous style books had pretty much looked only at scholarly literature. So they tended to repeat the same styles over and over again. But even there, they didn't use the term arts and crafts. They used the term craftsman, which derived from Gustav Stickley's magazine. But more and more, especially in this century, arts and crafts is the dominant term that's used by pretty much everybody. So looking at the origins of it, a lot of people see the arts and crafts movement as a reaction to the designs that were shown at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, which was the first of the modern World's Fairs, held in a building that is still one of the great achievements of the 19th century. It was built all of glass and iron, and the nave of, let me show you the interior. This nave is the length of 6 football fields. So it was huge, and it was so large that they could include trees inside the building that were there at Hyde Park when they started building. And here's showing you how there were divisions for nations, but also for specific manufacturing. And so a lot of manufacturers really were introduced to the world at this exhibition. But designers who looked at what these primarily manufacturing-based companies were turning out were not happy with the designs. And this gives you an idea of the range of chairs that were shown in the many hundreds of thousands of objects in this exhibition. The one on the right is solid coal. It was varnished, I guess, so the coal wouldn't rub off on your clothes, but there were all kinds of strange things like that. One of the people who wrote against this vision of mid-19th century design was John Ruskin, who was primarily a writer and teacher, but also a very good artist himself. I'll show you some of his work. He did a whole series of books that kind of set out his standards for what good design should be. His first book, which was reprinted many times, was called Modern Painters. And that really put Frederick Turner on the map as the greatest British painter of the era. But then also he did the 7 Lamps of Architecture, where he set out standards for building design. And he wrote 3 volumes called The Stones of Venice, which were very influential among architects and just people who were looking for good design principles. Here are some examples of his watercolors, the Kingfisher and the apple. And he didn't sell these. He did them mainly as tools for his own education. So there are quite a few that still survive in the various Ruskin collections. One of the main ones is at the University of Lancaster in Northwest England, and then his own house in the Lake District has quite a few also. And you can see from this range of drawings that some of them were done just as sketches for his own personal use. Like the one on the right is the Ca d'Oro, probably the most famous Gothic house on the Grand Canal. But he just did enough for his own, to remind his own memory. And then on the left, these are some details of the San Marco. And on the top, though, on the top right, you have this very finished watercolor of San Marco. So this, I think, people who knew these works of art, also this helped to cement his influence among designers. Well, Morris, as you can see, was a generation younger than Ruskin, and here are views of him in his 20s, in his 40s, and in his 60s. And he grew up in an upper middle class family in the suburbs of London. And this is his family home at Walthamstow. It wasn't designed by him, but it has become one of the major repositories of his design work since it was saved toward the end of his life by the people of Walthamstow, and it still is. In fact, it was just recently upgraded and renovated. Morris designed his own house with the help of I'm forgetting. Philip Webb, who was his best friend and did much work with him. And this was timed for his marriage to Jane. And these are the top picture is the backyard, and the bottom picture is the front. You always see the picture of the backyard. You never see the front for some reason. But now it's owned by the National Trust, and they have done a lot of research and are gradually restoring the interior. It was full of rich colors, and of course, it's happened all over the world. In around 1900 to 1910, they painted everything white, and they're still trying to recover from that. Philip Webb was also a very good artist as well as architect, and his standards of what good design were deeply based on the local vernacular buildings and materials. And this was just one of his most famous houses, and it is open to the public now, Standon in West Sussex. You can see the various materials that are used, the different styles of windows, the different roof lines, that it was typical of West Sussex houses to have rows of gables, and you can see how he incorporated that into this garden front. So he was a collaborator with Morris through his whole career, but also developed his own reputation, although I don't think he ever did a major public building. They were all houses. One of the things that they did together was establish the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Buildings and the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB. And you can see in the flyers on the right and the logo at the bottom that this is still very much an organization that's active and influential in England. And since they have a national historic preservation network with very strict regulations for the most important buildings, people still have to use the SPAB workshops and standards, which are basically based on trying to protect as much of the original fabric as possible. They don't see these houses and other buildings as stage sets, but as the actual material of the past. So whereas in, say, Williamsburg, there are 80-some original buildings, but then several hundred reproductions, they wouldn't do that in the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And so this was actually founded in 1877, which is before the National Trust in England and way before the Historic Preservation Program in the United States, which really only started with National Trust for Historic Preservation in the 1940s. So Morris's interests were far beyond architecture, which Philip Webb really handled, but he formed a company called Morris, Marshall, and Faulkner, later Morris and Company, in the 1860s that tried to revive many different decorative arts. And in many of these, they were pioneers. The technical ways of doing these things were rapidly dying out. And one of the things that made Morris so influential was that he learned how to do all these crafts himself. And for example, when he decided that he had to learn how to do dyeing of indigo dye, his daughter wrote that his up to his elbows, his arms were blue for about 6 months while he was learning that practice. And one of the things that they got early commissions for was decorative arts related to new churches, because a lot of the more progressive architects were thinking along the same lines that they were. This is not a religious window, but it is from Malmesbury Abbey on Arthurian themes. Malmesbury was, like many abbeys, was abandoned in the 1530s and 40s, but had been revived in the early 19th century. And these designs are by Edward Burne-Jones, who was another close friend of Morris and who worked with him throughout his career. And Burne-Jones had a very distinctive style of kind of long, thin, willowy figures, which tended to characterize Morris windows also. This is another Arthurian scene with King Arthur and Lancelot on the left and Guinevere and Isolde on the right. And this is by a different designer, Walter Dunlop. And I think you can see how different the shapes of the body types of the figures are, but always designed in the medieval style with each color a separate kind of glass. As the Morris's work became more successful, he found that he couldn't just work out of a house on a square in downtown London. He had to actually find a factory. And he found the Merton Abbey Works here, which was on the south side of metropolitan London, right on the River Wandle, which was great because in designing fabrics and dyeing textiles, you needed large amounts of fresh water. And this is a view. Unfortunately, this remained active until 1940, but in 1944, the entire thing was torn down and the site doesn't exist anymore. But we do have some photographs. This is showing a block printing of, I think this is wallpaper, but the fabric printing was similar. And you can see it was not done in any kind of mechanical way at all. The blocks that had the patterns were just loose, and you had to match them up to the pattern that was on the table in front of you just by eyesight. And Morris loved that because he didn't want things to look mechanical. He wanted them to look handmade. And here are some of the textile patterns that were most popular. Snake's head, which is a kind of a plant, not a snake actually, and peacock and dragon. And you can see the repeat in the peacock and dragon. I think the head of the dragon is in the center, the lighter color, and the peacock is down at the bottom. And this is probably the most famous individual pattern, Strawberry Thief. And one of the things you can see about this, the characteristics, is that the repeat is not particularly wide. The birds that are facing away from each other, you see are at the top and the bottom. Whereas in Baroque patterns, maybe the repeat might be 8 feet or something like that. But the other thing is that it's designed in a two-dimensional way with flat surfaces. It's not intended to make the leaves look three-dimensional or the birds, they're never at an angle, they're always at right angles. And he thought this was one of the lessons of the 1851, that the patterns that tried to, for example, make carpets look like they were leaves and trees, that was the wrong thing to do because it looked like your foot would go down into the tree. It should look flat. This is an interesting example. On the left is one of the original study designs for this trellis pattern, which eventually became one of the most popular patterns. And in contrast to the reprint on the right, you can see that he was toying with 3 different background colors. And I actually have seen the dark green that's at the lower center on the left, which makes the pattern look completely different. But this idea of different colorways was just catching on, I think, in fabric and textile design in general. This wallpaper became very popular, and I just was reading that in one of the large country houses, Castle Howard, where Rosalind Howard was a big fan of Morris's, she had 23 different patterns of wallpaper throughout the house. And now that they're going through the collections, they're finding quite a few rolls of unused wallpaper, which of course is very valuable now. But Willow Bough on the right is the one I think that it was probably most popular. And often if you see a TV show set in the late 19th or early 20th century, it has Willow Bough on the walls. Tapestry, of course, was the most time-consuming and expensive, and so there were only a few places where Philip Webb specified that he wanted sections of tapestry to be included in his interiors, and most people couldn't afford to just commission a tapestry that wasn't for a specific place in their house. But this is one, the Vision of the Holy Grail, and it like many late medieval and Renaissance, it shows several different scenes that took place at different times on the same roll. But on the right is Percival seeing the vision of what the Holy Grail was. On the left is him searching for it. The tapestry, The Forest, was one of the longest, and I cut this in two so you could see the whole thing, but the right side is at the bottom, and the rest of it is up above. And in this one, it was Philip Webb who designed all the animals. Henry Dearly was also involved in this. And of course, just fabricating them was enormously time-consuming. And they also had a special area that did embroidery. And embroidery is even more time-consuming. So they had their wives and children working on the embroidery patterns. Much of Philip Webb's furniture, like these tapestries, was designed for specific places and specific houses. And a lot of it was painted, again, with scenes from myth or from the Arthurian legends. This is the legend of St. George and the dragon. And this was actually in the Red House, Morris's first house. Morris was also interested in the vernacular furniture styles, and particularly of Sussex, which is where they had a lot of friends. And the Sussex chair was actually a reproduction of a vernacular chair that he saw, but these became extremely popular. And the same house I was telling you about earlier, they had a set of 24 Sussex chairs, which indicates how big the house was. And they're still made today. And of course, the Morris chair itself, which you see an early example of on the left, was actually named for William Morris. And its major feature was that the back was adjustable so that you could have it upright or reclining. And on the right is an example of Gustav Stickley's Morris chair, which he still called a Morris chair. But you can see the oak, smoother decoration, and a little bit heavier designing that was distinctive to Stickley here in the United States. In the later years, Morris became interested in printing because he wanted to revive early printing techniques from the 1500s. And this is actually a novel that he wrote, an ideal of a place, an ideal city, which was called News from Nowhere. And the name of the city was Erewhon, which is nowhere spelled backwards. This image, though, was his own country house, which you see still here today with the same standard roses that he showed in the original drawing. This is kind of at the southern edge of the county of Oxfordshire, and very much the materials of that place and time. It started in 1570, and he bought it in 1871. It was bequeathed to a society of scholars, and they just about 10 years ago fully restored it and were able to restore some of the original textile patterns and so on. The most famous of the Kelmscott was the name of the press. The most famous of the Kelmscott books was the Kelmscott Chaucer. And this is what it looked like. It would have been very difficult to read, I think, because your eye would be so distracted. And this was after he bought the Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire. They bought a house in Hammersmith, which was in the western suburbs of London, directly on the Thames River, and he called that Kelmscott House. And eventually the press was moved here to Hammersmith, which was a lot easier to function, get materials for. And it's still standing and owned by a Morris association. But I love this picture with the little semicircular cutout on the path there along the river. And at this point, the Thames is tidal, so a lot of the time, more than half of it is just mud. So it's not the most idyllic view. Just down the street and also backing up to the Thames was where his printer lived, Emery Walker, and he lived until 1933, and his house was never changed. And they were able to buy it about 20 years ago, I think. And so it's one of the few places that still has all the original textiles, the green color that was so popular, and all the different ways of framing pictures that were popular at that time. The view of the house itself is showing the back, looking toward the river. One of the big areas of decorative arts that Morris did not do himself was pottery, which is kind of ironic because that's the first thing we think of now when we think of arts and crafts. But he worked very closely with William de Morgan and his wife, Evelyn, who was also a painter. And many of their pots were collaborations between the two of them. But you can see from this that the things that they were being inspired by were Arabic and Middle Eastern textiles, pottery, with particularly this kind of a luminescent glaze that had a metal base to it that you can still see in Middle Eastern pottery. Very different in color and texture from the pottery that became associated with the arts and crafts movement in this country. And another area that he was not, that William Morris was not strong on was metalworking, although he collected it and was very interested in it. And his associate, Charles Ashby, became the leading exponent of metalwork, and he lived, as you can see, quite a bit longer. These are some of the things that he designed. The cup in the lower right is a prize cup that was an award for, I think, a essay or something like that. Much more elaborate than anything we would think of today. The picture I wanted to show you was that he also wanted to get away from London, and so he moved his craftsmen to Chipping Campden in the Cotswold area of Oxfordshire. And these buildings are still there and have recently been restored. And there's a wonderful Ashby and arts and crafts collection there that you can see today. Now, coming to the United States, there were several people who kind of adopted the whole program of William Morris. They wanted to have craftsmanship reflected in their materials. They wanted to have honest materials, traditional forms, and they were willing to try all these different crafts to achieve that. But the most successful one of these was Gustav Stickley. And he published a magazine. This is actually the first number of the first issue, the first volume, in 1891. The Craftsman magazine, "Life so short, the craft so long to learn," is the slogan, and then it has a short essay by Morris. But so this was widely circulated, and attracted people to his work, and it actually became almost like a mailer's catalog in the 20th century sense, that people waited to see the new designs coming out from his work. Well, he started out in Syracuse, New York, in upstate New York, in a house that was a typical kind of late Queen Anne or Foursquare house, that has been restored recently, and he redesigned the whole interior of it, and it was burned in 1902, but he rebuilt it then the way he would have really liked to have had it in the first place. And that has been restored just in 2017, and this is what it looks like today. You can see all the exposed woodwork, the ceilings, rafters, the posts. Most of the furniture is what English antique dealers now call brown furniture, that has natural material. And the table in the foreground is actually one of the more famous things. It has a leather top to it that is bolted onto the edges of the wood. In 1911, Stickley moved part of his activity, but not the whole thing, from Syracuse in upstate New York to the Craftsman Farms in New Jersey, which was in Morris County, which is kind of an ex-urban county from New York City, due west. And the house he built is one of the outstanding bungalows, which he was popular in. He was important in popularizing that term. It would originally have had an open porch, but he glazed it in almost immediately. And on the inside, it looks a little bit like a log cabin because it's largely built of logs that are left exposed. And this is now owned by a foundation, the entire 17-acre, I think, Craftsman Farms property in Morris County, and they're gradually restoring that. This is, on the left is the front page of the catalog, and you can see how similar it is to the William Morris Kelmscott built publishings with all the busy backgrounds. But on the right is also a catalog cover, and you can see how much the style has evolved. Cleaner lines and a more limited palette of earth tones. The magazine published a lot of style plans for Craftsman bungalows, which you could actually write to the magazine and get the full set of drawings if you wanted to. But then these were also collected in a series of publications, some of which are still in print today. And and on this, I want to point out that he was also, Stickley was interested in metalwork, and you can see he made this silver case for a glass jug. Must have been very difficult to do. And furniture also, there at the top are 3 different publications from recent years of examples of his work, and the grouping, of course, that was an early marketing idea also. In the little desk on the left, you can just see that there's some inlay, and after 1900, he became more interested in upgrading some of his more expensive pieces through the use of inlay. There's the leather table on the right with you can see the finishing tacks there. And on the left, the willowware that he also helped to revive. And of course, now that's a kind of a commonplace symbol of sitting on the front porch in the era before World War I. You would be sitting in a chair like this. In I think 1902, he hired Harvey Ellis, who was an architect from Rochester, New York, not far from Syracuse, who had also had kind of a peripatetic history of designing in the Midwest. And actually, John Gunther here is the expert on his career. And I think you've given that talk here, haven't you? But here he is wearing a Chinese robe and one of his cabinets with the inlaid design. He, in his years in St. Louis, before he went to New Jersey, he designed the Tower of Washington Terrace and also the Compton Hill Water Tower. And then a couple of major buildings too, like the St. Vincent Hospital in Normandy, which is still standing. Here are two of his late works for Stickley, and these are now very expensive and are sold mainly at auction only. Elbert Hubbard was actually a little older than Gustav Stickley and started his movement, the Roycrofters, a little bit earlier in 1895. He became famous for an essay that was in support of the Spanish-American War called A Message to Garcia, which was a bestseller and was in print for many, many years, about a man who was sent by Theodore Roosevelt to find Garcia, who was the leading an insurrection in the mountains of Cuba. And this was leading up to the war. There's still, the Roycroft community was in East Aurora, which is just a little bit southeast of Buffalo. And it was always considered an intellectually active place and a fairly affluent part of the metropolitan area there. And he created a campus. There are 14 buildings still left, surprisingly, and there's a foundation there that has been working to restore them. Here's the catalog of his books. The style should look familiar to you. And then on the right, you can see one of his ironworkers. Roycroft was particularly famous for work in iron. Today, the most important building surviving is the Roycroft Inn. And here's two views, the porch dining area on the right and the main hall on the left. Elbert Hubbard, unfortunately, went down on the Lusitania in 1915, and that was the end of his career. Stickley ran into financial problems in 1916, and although he lived for quite a few years after that, his business was pretty much closed up by 1920. Lewis's adventures in arts and crafts were even shorter. He came to St. Louis from also from the upstate New York in the 1890s, and he bought the land that is now University City around 1900, and he was sure that that was the direction of the most affluent development in the metropolitan area, and that's why he wanted to be there. And he built his magazine building, which was his publishing company offices. That's the building that's the City Hall today. It was built, designed by a local architect, and there he is sitting in the editor's office, which is now the city manager's office of University City. His biggest circulation magazine was the Women's Magazine, which was modeled after the Saturday Evening Post. It had, well, as you can see, these wonderful covers, which were an important part of its image, but also essays and articles of general interest. And then he also published a magazine called Beautiful Homes, which was his version of Stickley's Craftsman, where he promoted not all craftsman-style bungalows, but houses that were popular at the time. And many of them were houses that were being built right there in University City, especially University Heights number 1, which is the neighborhood just west of the City Hall. In 1909, he decided that in order to promote circulation of his magazines, he would offer tuition for people to come to University City and get university degrees at the People's University. But the only parts of it that ever really got going were the art department. And he built this building, which is now called the Lewis Center, just behind what's now the Public Library of University City on Kingsland, to be the art department. And it was designed with galleries with north-facing windows all along the upper floor. So it really was an ideal art creation space. And in particular, he was very successful in attracting some of the leading figures in the art pottery movement to come to University City, at least for a few years. And the most famous one was Adelaide Alsop Robineau, who also came from Syracuse, New York. And this is her most famous piece, the Scarab Vase, which was, she used a hard porcelain, which was so hard that you could actually carve it. And so, for example, on the right there, you can see places where she's gone the whole way through the thickness of the ceramics. And it was very difficult to do without having it collapse during firing. So nobody knows how many she threw away after firing, but the Scarab vase was considered one of her masterworks, and it was shown in some of the European art fairs in the early 20th century also. Here are some other examples of her work. And the bowl at the bottom is another example of where she pierced the whole way through the wall of the vessel. And the pink is important because of the way the color is kind of dripping down. That was a technique that they worked hard to get to so that it looked partially natural. And that was something derived from Chinese and particularly Japanese art pottery. Here's the whole group. And I wanted to show you this because two of the people are particularly important. Frederick Hurton Reed is the guy on the left. And he, in later life, designed Fiesta ware, which is the main 1930s Art Deco pottery. E.G. Lewis is the third from the left, and his wife Mabel is next to him, and she was an important potter too. And there's actually a piece by Mabel in the Baltimore Art Museum. And the person at the far right is Taxil Doa, who was lured here by Lewis from Sèvres, and where he had been the head. And that, of course, is the most prestigious of all the French potteries going back to the 18th century. And he was particularly interested in crystalline glazes, right? And this, especially well, all of these, but especially the upper left and the center one, show how the glazes would have kind of a flower explosion during the firing process. So he never knew exactly how they were going to turn out. But fortunately, our St. Louis Art Museum has been a great advocate for University City ceramics, and they published this book a few years ago, which I recommend. And they even have a special area of the museum now that has this, which is a fireplace designed by Frederick Hurton Reed and his wife. It was on Melrose Avenue, just north of Olive, but now it's on the third floor of the St. Louis Art Museum. Well, in addition to these three major arts and crafts movement centers in the United States, the movement had a much larger, expansive influence in architecture. And one of the ways was through what we're now calling the rustic architecture movement. And this is another style that wasn't even recognized in early style books, or if it was, they just said log cabin style, because it was considered just a style of pioneer builders. But actually, it was one of the high styles from the 1890s up through the 1930s, and both used by very wealthy people and by the public government in public parks. This is a lodge in Yosemite National Park, and many of the Western national parks have buildings that are in this style. Just this year, since I started giving this talk, this book has been published by Edward Ford, which is the first real serious look at what the rustic style was all about. And I love the title because that's what arts and crafts was all about anyway, the search for authenticity. And I have to point out, it might take you a long time to find the building here. It's this right here that's sitting on a ledge in this gorge, I suppose maybe in southern Colorado. The first big buildings that could be called rustic style buildings were built in the 1890s, particularly by William Durant, who was trying to get rich people to have summer houses in the Adirondacks instead of just on the coast of New England. And so this was one that he designed for a Vanderbilt. Unfortunately, this Vanderbilt also was on the Lusitania and died in 1915. So, and a lot of these buildings were kind of white elephants after the original fad for them kind of started to die out. Fortunately, this was left to Syracuse University, and eventually they were able to set up a foundation to keep it standing. This is Top Ridge, which was an even bigger, they called these camps, Adirondack camps, that was built for Marjorie Meriwether Post. And you may remember her name because her winter house was Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. And this one is now owned by a Texas millionaire who entertains Clarence Thomas here a lot of summers. But you can see how it would be easy to do. In addition to this main lodge here at Camp Top Ridge, there's something like 50 some other cottages on the grounds here. And the main lodge you can only get to by boat. It's on an island in the middle of a lake in the Adirondack Mountains. Well, an even more famous example of this style is the Old Faithful Inn at Yellowstone. Here's a poster from the 1930s, it looks like. And here's the interior of that. And so many people have seen that or have seen pictures of it. It's really a major American landmark. In the 30s, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, adopted the rustic style for many of their buildings that they built. The WPA mainly worked not in national parks, but in state park systems. And here in Missouri, for example, 21 of our state parks were designed and built by the WPA. We wouldn't have a a state park system at all if we hadn't had those grants in the 1930s. So, let's see, I'm sorry. The most famous one is this Timberline Lodge on the slopes of Mount Hood, which not only has all the arts and crafts detailing, but it has many murals by some of the WPA artists that are still preserved there. And of course, here in the St. Louis near metropolitan area, Pere Marquette State Park is a perfect example of this. And the lodge there has been restored just recently. On the bottom left is a vintage picture, but it still looks pretty much like that today. The Pueblo revival used to be considered a period revival style, but I see it more as an arts and crafts style because it was, again, taking the natural materials, the style that was the vernacular style of the region, and trying to adapt it to modern life instead of just fossilizing it. This is the city of Acoma, where the whole Pueblo is built on top of a mesa. But one of the key architects of the style was Mary Coulter. And I just saw a big article about her in the current AAA magazine of all things. There's like an 8-page article about her architecture in mainly Arizona, but also in California, where she did the interiors of the Los Angeles Railroad Station, which has recently been restored. But the Desert View Watchtower is at Grand Canyon National Park. The Hopi House is also at Grand Canyon. The Hopis were the one Pueblo that was in Arizona. The other Pueblo tribes were all in New Mexico. And this was also in Arizona, the Painted Desert Inn, which she collaborated with another architect on. And this has just recently been restored also. And the biggest hotel she was involved with was La Fonda, which actually, in the founding of the hotel goes back to the 1600s, but the present building was started in 1920 by August Rapp, and she did the interiors for that. And then another Santa Fe architect built an addition in 1929, and that's the building on the right. That was John Gaw Meem, G-A-W is his middle name. And he was probably the last highly respected practitioner of this Pueblo style, particularly the Cristo Rey Church, which is right in Santa Fe, dating from 1940. And we have an example here in St. Louis. This is the Lester Bush Faust House in Faust Park in Chesterfield. It was designed in 1919 because he wanted a place to show all his Pueblo pottery and Navajo carpets, because he was going to the south quite a few winters. And originally it's had the beams, which they call the vigas, sticking out along the parapet of the roof line. But when he married Mary Plant in 1926, she said, "These have to go." And so, but you could still see a little bit of the effect. The bungalow I mentioned in connection with Stickley, and of course that became the broadest movement of the whole thing, with hundreds of houses being built up until World War II, and again often from mail-in designs. But there too, it gradually became seen as a house designed for poorer people. And when Carswald was designed in 1923 right off Wydown Boulevard, the deed restrictions specifically said no bungalows. So, but here you can see some of the publications. And this is an example of how the bungalow was adapted to a densely built up urban area. On the left, you have the typical bungalow house with the porch going the whole way across, and then the large dormer opening up the second floor. But on the left, it's really just a two-story house with a porch across the front to make it look like a bungalow. So you see this mixture all through North St. Louis and South St. Louis. And here's a typical interior. The architectural firm in the United States who brought the bungalow to its highest level, I think, was Green and Green, who were actually from here. They went to school at the the Woodward Manual Training School, which was a branch of Washington University at the time. And then they moved to California, and their most celebrated house is the Gamble House. The Gambles were from Cincinnati, Procter and Gamble, and this was their winter home. And this is the same house from the back. You can see the boulder masonry, which would have been seen also in England. And this is the famous window from the front porch. I mean, from the front porch from the inside, where all the different openings are all part of one composition of a tree. And here's some other interiors. My favorite one of I think the Green and Green did over 100 houses altogether in the Pasadena area, and a few in the San Francisco area too. But this was in South Pasadena, built for Lucretia Garfield, who was the widow of the assassinated president, Andrew Garfield. And her son was an architect, so Henry, and he apparently got Green and Green to build this for him, and it was restored just a few years ago. And on there's an old picture of it in the upper right corner, but it's from the side, and you can see the side the fireplace there. We always think of Frank Lloyd Wright and as inventing the prairie school, a prairie style, but it was actually a school. And this H. Allen Brooks book emphasized that. There was a whole group of contemporaries, in addition to Wright, who were building in this style. But of course, he did 432 designs, so he was much more influential than any of them. And it ranged from his first house, which was designed for his own family in Oak Park, which still looks a lot like a shingle-style house that might have been on the coast of New England, to the Frederick Roby House, which is often thought of as the most important one, or most defining prairie house. It's on the campus of University of Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. But Wright also published some designs in magazines, just like Stickley did, and we have a few examples of those. The Hinchy House on Yale Avenue in University City, it was taken from a magazine that he published for the Ladies' Home Journal. And this one, the Edward Gocke House in Overland, is taken from another house designed from that time. I think this might have been from the House Beautiful magazine. And this has just recently been restored. This is another house in University City, built in 1921 when Wright was interested in concrete construction. And his contractor, Russell Barr Williamson, did houses on his own using that same poured concrete technique. And this has been owned by the same family for 50 years, I think. So it's in pretty good shape. And another person influenced indirectly by Wright was Ernest Wood, whose offices were in Quincy, Illinois. And this is a house outside Quincy. I want to end by talking about another Prairie School architect who had a St. Louis connection, Walter Burley Griffin. He worked with Marion Mahoney Griffin, who had been in Wright's studios before he went to Italy in 1911. And many of the drawings that we celebrate as examples of Wright's design were actually drawn by Marion. And so I think Walter never worked for Wright, but he had a practice in the Chicago area, and the Carter House is a good example of his work in Evanston outside Northwest University. But his brother lived in Edwardsville, and you can see this house on the main street going into Edwardsville, Illinois from the St. Louis area, and it still has the original interior. But one of his masterworks, I think, is the Stinson Memorial Library in Anna. Anna is about halfway between St. Louis and Carbondale, Illinois, if you go south. And it still has all the original colors also, which are the same palette as the Stickley colors, I think. But these kind of boulders at the lower level of the library, and then the windows going the entire way around the reading room. It still is a breathtaking building, and I encourage you to see it if you ever go out there. Of course, Walter Burley Griffin left St. Louis because he won the competition to build the capital of Australia at Canberra. And this is the main axis looking toward from the main hill toward the Capitol building, which wasn't built until the 1960s. You can see there's two metal things creating kind of a teepee effect there along this great axis. And the lake connecting them is called Lake Burley Griffin. So all his later work is in that area, and there's a conference every year about his work in Australia. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you very much. I think this is a subject that deserves a lot more detail, but this is an overview anyway. Thank you. I guess, yes, sir.
Yeah, so what I never quite understood was William Morris was sort of the father of craftsmen, of the craftsman era, and interested in hand built and handmade materials. So how did he, since his material his wallpapers, as you said, were so popular, do you have any idea of how he managed to ramp up production with?
I think it was just he raised prices. That eventually only very wealthy people could afford to buy his products. That's why you see his wallpapers in movie sets, it's never the clerk bedroom, bed sit that has the Morris wallpaper, it's the big mansion. Like, another good example of a movie that shows it is My Fair Lady, especially the main sitting room of Henry Higgins' house has Morris wallpaper.
Speaking of movies, you didn't mention one of the most important things about the Timberland Lodge, which is that's the hotel from The Shining.
It's where?
It's the hotel from The Shining.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's the outside of.
Oh, yeah.
The
Mhm.
Shining.
I've never seen that. I need to do that.
It's kind of scary. It's a scary one. It'll haunt you, don't see it.
All right, well, thank you very much again for coming.
Thanks for stopping by for the lecture this evening, everyone. We'll have another lecture at the end of April. I'm gonna get the April 28th, I believe. Double check that. April 28th, there'll be John Pellerin on the National Park Service. We give me a talk called William Rumbold's Dome Revisited. Hope to see you all then. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
Oh, yes, I have a friend who just moved there.
Yeah, so that's my old neighborhood.
Oh, it's a lovely area.
And the whole street is pajamas. Well, you know, one of Walter's really good friends. And they're very modest. Because this is kind of it's actually much like View City. It has big houses up on the hill, you know, and then as you come down the hill, you know. And then like in my, where I live in this English cottage. It was very rustic, it built in 1937. But tons of classic, you know, bungalows.
Yeah.
But just about 2 blocks away is Walter's really big place. And he also did, as an architect, like, just added on to Walter really second house.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, and when that fit, in the North Shore.
Yeah.
Because I used to live in Evanston, so I knew that house.
You know, there's an annual conference, the Walter Burley Griffin
I
Society.
know, I need to do that, because
I've been there.
I.
In Mason, Iowa.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mason